Despite everything written about Jimi Hendrix since his death, vital questions remain unanswered.
Hendrix linked up with the Black Panthers, and for that reason, he was a dead man.
Two people are central to the Hendrix story. One is his manager, Mike Jeffrey. The majority of Hendrix's earnings were paid into a secretive Bahamas-based trust called Yameta, set up by Mike Jeffrey. Most of the millions that went into it never came out. Jimi's deal gave him just 3% of his recording and publishing deals, while Jeffrey took an astonishing 60%.
Jeffrey was stealing money from him, sabotaging his career, planning people around him to spy on him and to subvert his own activities, his own life. And Hendrix, yeah, he had a growing awareness that this was happening to him, and he knew who to blame.
Jimi had several run-ins with mafia hoods in New York, but once again, Mike Jeffrey was on hand to sort things out. Jimi was intrigued by how well Jeffrey seemed to know them. By 1970, many celebrities were attending anti-Vietnam War rallies and Black Panther fundraisers, as well as contributing considerable amounts of cash. Amongst them was Jimi Hendrix. It was at this point that Jimi first became aware that amongst his followers were members of the Black Panther Party. Hendrix's link to the Black Panthers would prove to be a major factor in how his future was shaped. Jimi said, "They come to concerts and I sort of feel them there. It's not a physical thing, but a mental ray. It's a spiritual thing." On the issue of Black Power, Hendrix started to make some ill-advised statements to magazines and newspapers.
Well, I think Jimi Hendrix was on safe ground as long as he was apolitical. And he really didn't have much interest in all of this until the Black Panthers came along and worked on his sense of compunction. And therefore, he made statements in the teen press about the Black Panthers going to Washington and actually killing people and so forth. And he said it sounded like war, but that's what we have to have. We need war. Well, you talk that way, they take notice in Washington, D.C.
The headlines screamed that Hendrix had died the typical rock star death, a drugs overdose amid fame, opulence, and decadence. The inquest found that Jimi had died from inhaling his own vomit after taking Monica's barbiturate sleeping tablets. The inquest accepted completely Monica's story, but left an open verdict, which meant that the actual circumstances of the death could not be determined. Monica was the only witness called. None of the medical team or ambulance men were consulted. After Jimi's death, rumors abounded. One had him overdosing on heroin at a friend's flat and his body taken and placed in Monica's flat. Another had him flown to Hollywood, murdered, and flown back on a private jet. And yet another rumor had him die at a famous rock star's apartment with Devon by his side. However, 22 years later, Steve Roby and Kathy Etchingham traced the ambulance men, Reg Jones and John Sewer. They insist Danneman was not at the flat when they arrived and that Hendrix was already dead.
His mucous membrane's all black. He's been dead for about 4 or 5 hours.
But it's him.
And if Monica Danneman is to be believed about what happened on their last night together, why was Hendrix fully dressed?
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
And how could the ambulance men possibly miss seeing someone who was supposed to be there? In other words, Monica. The ambulance men also contradicted Monica when they both asserted that no one, apart from themselves, had traveled to the hospital with Hendrix.
Well, there's no pulse. I think this one's gone, actually.
Equally, Dr. Bannister, the then surgical registrar, stated that Hendrix had been dead for at least 7 hours when he was admitted to the hospital. Dr. Bannister noted that Hendrix's lungs were filled with vomit and masses of red wine.
Somebody take this away.
Let's have a look. I'd say,
If we can close these curtains.
Should we put him into the recovery position?
They'd never before seen a man who drowned in his own red wine.
You call it. See where we go.
Okay. Time of death.
So how did the red wine get into Jimmy's lungs? The 60s and 70s were turbulent political times, and now compelling evidence has emerged that points to a sinister coalition between the United States government and organized crime, set up specifically to murder prominent leaders of the new youth culture, including rock musicians.
Jimi Hendrix was killed for two reasons. First of all, he had made statements in the teen press calling for the Black Panthers to go to Washington, D.C. and shoot the place up. Secondly, he had done a benefit for Bobby Seale and the Chicago 8. And that got the attention of the FBI and a program called COINTELPRO, which was a surveillance and assassination program. And it led to the murder of 28 Black Panthers. Tupac Shakur makes 29 because he was a Black Panther. Hendrix linked up with the Black Panthers, and for that reason, he was a dead man.
COINTELPRO was fostered by J. Edgar Hoover, the chief of the FBI for a very long time, in the late 1950s. And the original goal of the program was to eliminate, in their words, neutralize or defame any kind of young, in Hoover's exact words, messianic black leader who could galvanize all parts of the civil rights movements, black nationalist movements, and white sympathizers, white liberal sympathizers, okay, and get them going into a very progressive, powerful movement.
The first clues that Hendrix was a government target emerged from declassified FBI files.
In 1976, there were a group of students at Santa Barbara, University of California, who put in for FOIA documents on Jimi Hendrix. They got 6 heavily blacked out pages. They appealed, they got 7 more pages, and they learned from those documents that Jimi Hendrix had been put on a security index established by the FBI to have him and everyone else on that index rounded up and placed in detainment camps in the account of a national emergency.
Another interesting thing about the FBI files in this particular case is that they're in national security terms redacted, which means blacked out or censored. Okay, so that very much crucial information, is still not available to the public. As somebody who's fished through these files for 7 or 8, 9, 10 years, it's usually the most interesting, the most sensitive stuff, okay, that gets blacked out. That's the stuff that they really don't want you to know, that puts them in a very much compromised kind of a position.
We now know from declassified United States government files that COINTELPRO counterintelligence program was part of a major CIA operation that was called Operation MHCHAOS.
MHCHAOS is a CIA operation that begins in the early 1960s, and it targets basically liberals, anti-war protesters, okay, underground newspapers, left-wing journalists, etc. And its target is to infiltrate these kinds of movements, lead them astray, okay, and eventually create enough friction in them to actually destroy them and render them weak and helpless. MHCHAOS became one of the biggest programs that the CIA had because they felt that they really had to control these forces, which at that time are really gaining some momentum and power, okay? And so they wanted to, the object was to prevent them from unifying, from becoming, keep them split as far apart, so they don't become one huge political force.
Nixon was very concerned about this. You had major operatives like Hunt and Liddy, who were aware of all this. Tom Charles Houston from Young Americans for Freedom comes to the Nixon administration and draws up plans for detaining dissidents, including specifically Jimi Hendrix, right? He wasn't a threatening character. Right? He was a musician. That's where his mind and that's where he wanted to be. But as soon as he engaged in politics, it's a different story. And I think that if you're a celebrity, you kind of have to gauge your statements, because you say the wrong thing, you can end up in deep, deep trouble.
Well, Hendrix's music was so powerful, and it was so wide appealing. And by 68, 69, especially after his appearance at the Woodstock thing, which is probably the apogee, of his career, it's become a kind of icon, in rock and roll history. Hendrix on stage with the national anthem, etc. He was really ready to become the number one, rock act, in the United States. And with his ties into some of these black nationalist, black power movement, and his liberal sympathies already, if you had Jimi Hendrix actually funneling money into groups like this, then that would really put them in a position to actually spread in a really kind of potent way. One of the problems that a group like the Black Panthers always had is they never had enough money to really finance larger operations that they wanted to get into. With someone like Jimi Hendrix funneling money to them, that would be a serious possibility.
The huge amounts of money in the music business had forged an unlikely partnership between the CIA and the Mafia.
Of course, the Mafia had their hooks into the music business going back to the jukebox wars. And then in World War II, the OSS started up a program called Operation Underworld, which entailed the actual recruitment of key Mafia figures to operate in Italy and the United States, right? And after World War II, they continued this brotherhood between the CIA and the Mafia that continues to the present day. Now, under Operation Chaos, I mentioned that all intelligence agencies have been brought into the umbrella program. Well, the Mafia was brought into it too because they were central to the music business itself, and they could be used to control and ultimately, in some cases, murder musicians who are outspoken in their opposition to the U.S. government.
Some of the things that you look at, some of the landmarks, that have a lot of similarity to other assassinations that someone like me has studied in the Hendrix case is, first of all, you have the use of an inside operator, somebody very close, and somebody who the target trusts, all right, but doesn't understand that the guy already has a dual allegiance. In this case, it appears to be Michael Jeffrey, his manager, who it's been unearthed later, had both intelligence ties and mob connections.
Mike Jeffrey is an interesting take. He begins working for the government in the National Service. He works into the military. He joins military intelligence, and at that point, his career enters an obscure phase. So there's little known about his activities with MI6, except to say that he was stationed in Egypt and he spoke Russian fluently. He boasted about his involvement with Mafia figures, but no one took him seriously. After his death, there were documents and news articles that he had in his possession that indicated that possibly he was telling the truth. And there are indications over the years that yes, he did have mob ties. Jeffrey went out of his way to make life difficult for Hendrix. He would book him in Toronto one night, and then he'd have him booked in Miami, and then the next night he'd do one night in California, and he kept him exhausted, he kept him dependent, and he kept him under control. Jeffrey was a very devious human being. He set up a dummy corporation he called Yameta, and much of the stolen money went into this corporation, and then it was divided between two banks, the Chemical Bank of Nassau and the Nova Scotia Bank. Jeffrey was stealing money from him, sabotaging his career, planning people around him to spy on him and to subvert his own activities, his own life. And Hendrix, yeah, he had a growing awareness that this was happening to him, and he knew who to blame. And then when he discovered that the money was missing, he filed a suit against Michael Jeffrey. And Hendrix's death occurs just before Michael Jeffrey's appearance in the courtroom to answer to Jimi Hendrix on the lawsuit.
Not only was Michael Jeffrey stealing Jimi Hendrix's money, his contract as manager was ending, and he also felt that Hendrix's new music wouldn't sell. And he had a $2 million insurance policy on Hendrix's life. Clearly, it suited the US government, the Mafia, and in particular, Michael Jeffrey, for Jimi to be neutralized. But just how did Jimi Hendrix die?
All right, now it's been said for 30 years that Jimi Hendrix choked on his own vomit. It was said that he died of a heroin overdose. Of course, none of that's true. He didn't choke to death on his own vomit. Something had to make him sick, right? So now it's known that he took 9 Vesperex tablets. These are sleeping pills the night that he died. Now, it's been said that he died from an overdose of barbiturates. The problem is Jimi Hendrix was a chronic insomniac. He was used to barbiturates, and the Vesperix that he took really had very little effect on him. He took 2 tablets, he didn't feel a thing, couldn't go to sleep. He had taken an amphetamine capsule at a party the night before, so the 9 Vesperix tablets he took really had no connection to his ultimate end. But when he was wheeled into the emergency room, his throat was cleared, and the physician wrote that great masses of red wine came gushing out of his stomach and his lungs, right? So as I reenact the death of Jimi Hendrix, he must have been held down, a gallon of wine poured down his throat until he drowned. There were only 20 milligrams of alcohol in his blood when he was brought to the emergency room, which means there wasn't even enough time for that alcohol to enter his system. So the cause of death was drowning, and it looks to me like it was a forced drowning.
That's finally, they're picking apart. The grape chokes me almost, but I can't let the joke come out.
Jimi Hendrix had a packet of 42 Vesperix tablets in his pocket. Now, Eric Burden of the Animals has claimed that Jimi Hendrix committed suicide. If that was the intent, it's very likely that he would have taken all the barbiturates in his possession. So it's clear that suicide was not the object. If suicide had been the intent, and if he had died accidentally, it's doubtful that he would have been fully dressed. He was found fully clothed. When the ambulance drivers arrived, they said that no one else was there. Monica Danneman claimed to be there, and of course her testimony has holes in it the size of the Brooklyn Bridge. Now we know, because he was fully clothed, right, we know that it wasn't an accident. We know that he didn't just die in his sleep. He was in his London hotel room, and he must have been restrained. It's very doubtful that he sat down to drink the red wine and filled up his stomach and his lungs. I've never heard of such a thing. The only other possibility is that his head was held in a sink full of wine until he drowned, or he was held down and it was poured down his throat. And I think this is the most likely scenario, because it's doubtful that his stomach would be so full of wine. I think he was held down, it was forced down his throat, filled his lungs, and he was dead within minutes. After Hendrix died, Michael Jeffrey acted like a guilty man. He came to the funeral, but he sat in his car outside. He actually confessed to a jazz producer by the name of Alan Douglas, who was a good friend of Jimi Hendrix, that he had something to do with the murder. He wasn't entirely clear about it, but it was clear to Alan Douglas that Michael Jeffrey was making a confession.
Even after Hendrix's death, the classic patterns of an Operation Chaos killing were followed.
Another symptom in this case is the investigation that follows the rather questionable circumstances of his death, which never takes the time, very rushed, doesn't take the time to reconcile the different witness testimony surrounding his death. The autopsy is very, very questionable because it basically says that he died in his own vomit, okay? And a later study revealed that it was actually drowning, with large amounts of red wine, okay? And then later on, you have this policy of defamation or degradation, whatever term you want to apply to it, in which the target then is smeared posthumously.
Discreditation of Jimi Hendrix began immediately after his death. Newspapers around the world reported that he died of a heroin overdose. And of course, it's well known that Jimi Hendrix didn't take heroin. He didn't indulge in it. He didn't care for it. He was a psychedelics man, right? So he didn't die of heroin. There was no heroin in his blood, right? Yet the press made this claim.
I would be willing to guess that 90% of the people familiar with Hendrix think he OD'd on heroin when Hendrix actually never took heroin. All right? And then you get these very mysterious fatalities that take place around the people who are close to him. Devin Wilson, one of his girlfriends, dies in 1971 out the window of an 8th-story hotel. All right? Then Jeffrey himself perishes in another suspicious airplane crash in 1973. And then the last girlfriend, Monica Danneman, who an alleged suicide, carbon monoxide poisoning in 1995, just before she's supposed to go on the air and discuss and tell the truth about the very strange circumstances surrounding Jimmy's death.